Hi guys! There are times when the universe in its vastness feels the need to remind you that your needs, your desires are unbelievably tiny in the face of cosmic forces like technology, which are currently shaping our entire civilization, and tech problems can result in you failing to produce a video. But I do have at least what I would like to call a Zoat half finished, or at least a third finished, and I will endeavor to treat it as such rather than a Zoat incomplete. So let's just jump right in and enjoy painting what I have here. So this is a Zoat. If you're unfamiliar with what a Zoat is, that's not entirely surprising. Zoats were a little bit of an enigma even in the old days in Rogue Trader and occasionally making a foray into second edition Warhammer, although they kind of faded away with time. So this is one of the client kingdoms, client galaxy um, dominating species that essentially got eaten by the Tyranids. And in the case of the Zoats, however, they were not physically eaten and incorporated into the species. They were psychically dominated and added to the Tyranid species, so to speak, or to the Tyranid Hive fleets. And in early Games Workshop fluff, they ended up becoming ambassadors and becoming sort of translators and just really the kind of things that Tyranid you don't expect Tyranids to do, to kind of take like lesser species, so to speak, under their wing and put them to use. So I guess you got to bear in mind that like a lot of Games Workshop stuff is still loosely based on historical precedent. A lot of the stories of 40k as well as fantasy, Warhammer Fantasy, were originally based on stories from history. So I'm reminded of what happened when the Roman Empire essentially ran headfirst into Dacia, and although they eventually did get the hang of fighting Dacia and eventually beating them, this was under Emperor Trajan. Um, Eventually, it turns out that the Romans had need of skilled heavy cavalrymen, and the Sarmatians, who were another client subject kingdom of the Dacians at that time, eventually filled that role admirably in the Roman armies, even though they were not numerous. Even though they were kind of independent and hot-headed, eventually what happened was that the Romans saw the merit of their fighting abilities. They were so impressed that they eventually forced them to join them and had mercenaries essentially. Well, not mercenaries in the sense that they weren't paid, but they were a client kingdom of the Romans, and they ended up becoming, a really important part of that particular small section of Roman history. Let's not forget that in the big span of things, I mean, Rome wasn't built in a day, clearly, and over their many thousands of years of history, essentially much happens to the Romans. But at that point, at least, the Sarmatians represented everything that they saw in a noble warrior culture who could add value to the armies of Rome, and therefore they took the Sarmatians into their forces, distributed them into various LA, and integrated them essentially into the armies that were proceeding eastward at that point. Of the Dacians themselves, they sacked the capital of Samnitsa, and essentially, well, you can sort of read it on Trajan's column now, can't you? Trajan built his famous column to commemorate his victories against the Dacians, and the Sarmatians are there. Now, why am I going on this long, weird historical tangent? Well, because when a powerful galaxy spanning and galaxy consuming macroorganism called the Tyranids eventually runs into a particularly tough nut to crack, even they are occasionally impressed enough to the point where they feel the need to incorporate them into their forces, and this is essentially where we end up with the Zoats. So Zoats are centauroid, gigantic, extremely powerful, quite technologically advanced. They have their own unique, culture and ways of waging war, and they eventually gave the Tyranids enough of a tough time that at some point the Tyranids decide that rather than assimilate them like every other species the Tyranids have ever encountered, they decide that the Zoats are worth preserving to some extent. Now, among their many, I guess, positive traits, or among their many strengths, is the fact that Zoats are highly independent. Whether this is because they are, psychically dominant to some extent, or they are actually just extremely hard-headed, um, or a mix of both, because the fluff is never really clear about what happens to the Zoat race, other than they eventually become deprived of free will and incorporated into the Tyranid Hive fleet. Um, yeah, so quite an interesting and unique story because this is something that you rarely see the Tyranids do. Allow a modicum of, if not free will, then basically a modicum of their previous intellect of a subject species to sort of pop through the veil in that sense, rather than being turned into a mindless eating machine by assimilation into the Hive fleet. So Zoats are kind of interesting, kind of cool, and I think for me they cover a niche. They cover a sort of time-tested historical story that we see that in the clash of cultures, sometimes one culture who, although dominant and ascendant in their conflicts, eventually see the benefits of allying or at least incorporating, assimilating a particularly powerful defeated enemy. And that, to me, added a lot of color to basically 40K's exploration. So just to sort of keep going with this analogy, if you see the Tyranids as and the all-conquering Roman Empire, they're clearly having defeated another galaxy's worth of client species. They essentially run into the Sarmatians and incorporate them. And these space Sarmatians are incredibly powerful and incredibly dominant. In a long, 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 long time ago, a young me, basically on a school trip, walked into a bookstore somewhere abroad and came into contact with, for the first time, with Space Marine, the novel by Ian Watson. And say what you will about that bizarre book, there is a really interesting segment where Space Marine Imperial Fist scouts essentially travel into the bowels of a Hive ship, and there they encounter for the first time, among other Tyranid creatures, a Zoat. And this Zoat, although clearly unarmed, manages to beguile the Space Marines with thoughts of cooperation and aid against the powers of chaos, to such an extent that the Space Marines let their guard down momentarily, and that's when it's revealed that the Zoat was just buying time. It charges in, rips an Imperial Fist scout like limb from limb. I think it was Von Ruther actually, the sergeant. Basically sorts him out, and then eventually gets gunned down in a welter of fire. But it really shows you how powerful, how sneaky, and how potentially dangerous the Zoats could be. And yeah, I mean, they are an extremely interesting race. And to me, they added that kind of story, basically a story that's kind of missing in today's Tyranid Hive fleets, wherein the prevailing story is just that Tyranids are kind of, well, all conquering and have gone around eating people for a long time, or seem to be fleeing from another threat or some such nonsense. It's kind of nice that the stories of this nature kind of existed back in the day. That occasionally the irresistible force of the Tyranids would run into the immovable object or something like the Zoats, and eventually it is something else that causes the Zoats to move. Assimilation within the Tyranid fleet, whether they actually believe this or not, or else they essentially have a little bit of a, you know, subjugation moment and become a slave people of the Tyranids. It's not entirely clear because, for the most part, Games Workshop didn't explain what it is that motivated the Tyranids to, or rather the Zoats to work alongside the Tyranids. And the Zoats themselves sort of fade from 40k history not long after, and it's a little unfortunate because, as you can see, Zoats are fascinating and they're really quite unique and quite special. So, in honor of the Tyranids, I have painted this guy a shade of red. Specifically, this is kind of a mix of my usual red blend, which is typically Blood Angels red and blazing, well, not blazing, Gryphhound orange, and basically I added our flesh mix, which is Guilliman Flesh and Seraphim Sepia. Seraphim Sepia. And that's basically given us a sort of fleshy kind of mix. Quite interesting. And a good callback to the early Hive fleets and background lore of the Tyranids. Sorry guys, I'm trying to look for Gorgrunter fur. Finally found it. Don't mind me. As with all the tech issues, we will work through this problem. This too shall pass. Namaste, all of that. So, yeah, so I meant to do this Zoat as a part of a larger video that kind of focused on the idea of assimilation, body horror, that kind of thing. But unfortunately, a lot of that got cut off yesterday when I was trying to record it. Eventually, I was ended up with a lot of footage with not a lot of audio. I hope at this point you realize that the audio voiceover is a fairly important part of my videos. And unfortunately, because I essentially record live audio, right? Because I kind of think that it's more interesting that way. Unfortunately, I could not use the footage that I recorded easily without doing a voiceover separately. But it's okay. We'll make do with what we have and we'll move on. So essentially, what I did with that arm with that interesting sort of like Tyranid flamer weapon, I think it's a flamer because it appears to have some kind of fuel tank, this kind of weird egg sort of thing, which I kind of painted to look like a living organism because I thought it resembled kind of like the colonial cooperation, I guess, organic cooperation between different species of, I guess, salps for Portuguese men of war. I like the idea that colonial organisms sometimes work collaboratively to create function groups within organisms. And you have the bizarre thing, which is the Portuguese men of war, which is a jellyfish that is essentially composed of multiple kind of comb jelly-like creatures called salps. And each one of these salps has a specific role to play within the operation of the larger Portuguese men of war. Very Tyranid, isn't it? Kind of cool. This very much dovetails with what early Tyranid designs. I don't know whether they're still current Tyranid storylines, to be perfectly honest. I'm a little bit out of it. But essentially, I think it was the Flesh Borer that essentially is a combination between a kind of spider-like creature that sort of takes on the rough shape of a gun, and it is powered by biological neural impulse from the Tyranid to chew up a little bug-like ammunition species and essentially spit out the incandescent, like spontaneously combusting innards of that particular bug as a goblet of ammunition. Kind of cool. I really like stuff like this. I think with the way the rate of releases come with Games Workshop these days, it's a little bit hard to expect them to try to release information or storylines which are that detailed compared to these earlier stories. I think generally speaking, the camera for 40k has kind of zoomed out a little bit, and these days we get larger views of the Imperium and its adjacent spaces. But I think Tyranid stories kind of always were interesting because they had that sort of xenobiologist kind of dimension where they sort of explored, the minutiae of how Tyranids function. And I don't know whether that's still a thing these days, but I don't hear as many stories about, the way individual Tyranid organisms function and operate anymore. But that's just maybe, a kind of bias that I have because I don't consume all 40K stuff anymore. There is a lot of it, to be perfectly honest, and not all of it is of the best quality in my opinion. So yeah. Anyway, so Zoats, yeah, basically the remnants of a proud warrior people, proud and highly effective warrior people, into the Hive colonies of the Tyranids, who essentially put them to use as translators, ambassadors, and general, I guess, diplomats of the Hive fleets, which I guess is a concept that's kind of lost a bit of currency in today's Tyranid fleet, where I think at this point we have focused entirely on what the Tyranid fleets do and a lot less on what the Tyranid fleets, how the Tyranid fleets function at a micro level. Kind of unfortunate, but I guess it's just how it is these days. Um, so yeah, Zoats. So Zoats are also interesting because they feature in Warhammer Fantasy. They are one of the strange kind of mercenary creatures that you can kind of recruit in certain places in Warhammer Total War 3. But even in the original core Warhammer setting, it was possible to occasionally use Zoats as allies. So in the earlier editions of Warhammer Fantasy, you could recruit Zoats as just creatures, and the exact definition of what they were was not quite so expanded upon. There was, even though like 40K and fantasy did kind of coexist, and many of the creatures exist in both of these, there was very little sort of talk as to how the coexistence or kind of the crossover kind of really took place. But suffice to say, in Warhammer Fantasy, you also had star navigating slan. Yep, the same frogs, but the book is quick to tell us that the oldest slan still extant in Warhammer at the time of the 5th edition Lizardman Army book were of the 2nd generation. So there is an enigmatic 1st generation of slan that we've never seen before, and therefore kind of points us in the direction of their limitless star traveling potential. And alongside, we see the Amazons, who were humans, originally descendants of a Norse tribe that kind of wandered into Lustria, and essentially when natives started living there and ran afoul of the lizardmen many times, in particular their skinks, and eventually turned into something of, I guess, allies of convenience every now and then, because clearly the lizardmen were less annoyed with the Amazons than they were with other species invading their turf, such as the Skaven of Clan Pestilence. So Zoats existed in that setting as well, and they were somewhat connected to, the idea that you had starfaring other species that were more recent arrivals on the Warhammer world, and that's pretty much all there is to it, because the Zoats don't stay in the storylines for Warhammer Fantasy for long. Of this original set of miniatures, so only one set of miniatures of Zoats, as far as I'm aware, was ever produced for the mainline games of 40K and Warhammer. So this particular miniature is particularly representative of that group of models. That the lower half of that particular set of models, there is only one design, and this is it essentially. But they did have multiple torsos that you could replace. So what I've just done is I've added a bit of dark sand to my rather complicated red and flesh mix that I described earlier. And yeah, so I've added a little bit of dark flesh to create a sort of fleshy highlight. Again, this red skin tone isn't common on Zoats. I think most of the time they're painted green. Later on, when Games Workshop did release Zoats for Blackstone Fortress, I think there was one or two Zoats from Blackstone Fortress, and there was certainly one Zokath the Zoat was released for Blood Bowl second season, sorry. Yeah, which is essentially 5th edition. Yeah, so what we have here is a Zoat. And for the longest time, it was the only Zoat until fairly recently when Games Workshop, in their schizophrenia, finally remembered that Zoats existed and started putting them in their games once more. And this is a good thing. I appreciate it. I think it's nice to see these older models and older concepts kind of find their way back into modern 40k. And because I guess Zoats don't fit neatly into our assumptions about races like the Tyranids, which over the course of having been expanded more and more upon by Games Workshop, there is very little, in my opinion, mystery to Tyranids and the way they operate now. And the sort of resurfacing of Zoats in some form at least is a good thing towards making the universe feel big and unknown and unknowable in a way, just scaling back the size of the universe to make it bigger and more intimidating. I think that's a good thing. I think the challenge with 40k these days is that so much has been written, so much has been elucidated, so much new, slightly dubious fluff has been added from what I would call a godlike perspective, that the universe now feels kind of overexplored. And it's nice to see weird xeno races that kind of don't fit into any of the molds of present day 40k come back into existence again, and I really like that as a concept. But that's just me, 40k Groniard, and well, frankly, opinionated ex-player and now pure collector, painting ancient models from what I consider to be the best point of 40k. Your mileage will vary. Yeah. So this model, I mean, it's not the most complicated model in the world, and to be honest, it's also not the most technically brilliant model in the world. It's kind of got a lot of flaws, unfortunately. It's got a lot of weird design choices which I don't really agree with, but that's part and parcel of collecting miniatures. Sometimes it's the jank that makes, I mean, as one of my friends loves to say, it's the jank that makes Warhammer look interesting, and sort of the kind of half thought out ideas that play out on the surface that make miniatures so interesting to collect as snapshots in time of a development process that has since gone on well past that point. So we have essentially a centauroid alien dude who appears to be reptilian, mostly in origin or in material or in concept. And he's got sections of bio-organic armor with lots of pipes and hoses running around over his surface. And then you've got this bizarre kind of Phantom of the Opera kind of mask where half of his face is covered in it and the rest of it isn't. And I think you're beginning to see where I have a bit of a problem with this, because there is an asymmetry to his face. You've got this weird sort of eye with multiple lenses on one side. That makes sense. But then you've got what appears to be an actual biological eye on this side, perhaps. Or maybe it's a lens, but it doesn't quite line up with the other eye. And that isn't the end of the world, but it is at least a little bit strange. And so what we'll try to do is to lean into the asymmetry of it all and do those eyes in two different ways. I've already added an eye or two to his flamer weapon over there, and one in front. And I think that really adds to the idea that these are basically composite life forms incorporating many subspecies, which are maybe not sentient but definitely subservient to the overall function of the Portuguese man of war creature that you see before you. And I kind of like that concept, and I kind of want to lean into it a little bit more. So even this weird power fist looking thing, which I imagine was probably a product of wanting to have some kind of internal integrity in terms of technology between the different races. Um, yeah, but it's clearly a power fist, isn't it? It's a power fist, but it looks kind of cool. So what I'll do is I'll try to paint it to look like it's made of the same ancient bone color that I use for when I have something that looks old and ossified, and basically it allows us to have a bone color which tends to be a neutral color and tends to recede. It allows us to have our cake and eat it, because by adding a bit of Gryphcharger gray, it essentially makes it a bit of a green tone. There is a coolness to it, which makes for a more interesting miniature, in my opinion. And yeah, I kind of like the way that looks. But then we'll come back in and we'll highlight this with regular bone colors, and I think that sort of introduces that natural bone color back into it. So the hope is that this basically creates the sense of a composite material wherein you have a bioorganic material that is, when fresh and new, essentially appears in this sort of greenish bone color, but then as it ages and it flakes off and it spalls at the surface and essentially becomes crusty and old, essentially thins and becomes more bone-like, more yellow and flaky. So that's a lot to convey in one color, but you get the idea, right? So sometimes we don't need to show off how every single thing works, but we kind of want to suggest for those who would basically take a closer look and who would sort of get a little bit more invested in the world building, to get them to think about how these things work. And sometimes all you really need to do is suggest the idea behind it, and that sort of creates the desire to explore and kind of be amused by it. So yeah, so what we have for his flesh areas is something approaching bubblegum pink, but essentially it's a fleshier version of Tyranid skin, and I kind of like the idea that some part of that terrible bargain that the Zoats entered into with the Tyranids, either willingly or unwillingly as a species, kind of still exists in some form as an imprint on their skin. And that kind of really puts into perspective that Faustian bargain that they did. So in the law, all it really states is that the Zoats appear to have traded their independence, traded their freedom. Of course, we mean freedom in the intergalactic sense, in the self-determinism sense. I don't think these were a bunch of gun-toting, Confederate types essentially giving up their right to vote. This is really a case of a species, willingly or unwillingly, as the case may be, because psychic domination, we know, is involved in some extent, giving up its ability to control their situation to another species, which, depending on how you look at it, is kind of body horror too, right? And yeah, it's a kind of story that you don't really see much in 40k these days, and I kind of miss that. But yeah, anyway, so this is a slightly different mix of Gryphcharger Grey and Skeleton Horde. So the nice thing about this mix is also is that by sort of varying the amount of Gryphcharger Grey and Skeleton Horde, you can get slightly different colors out of it. And I really like the idea that you have something that you can vary the amount of, I suppose, ossification into the bone. You can make something that's a little bit more green, which to me suggests that it's a little bit newer and fresher, and something that's more bony colored, which would to me suggests that it's a little bit older and a little bit more ossified, a bit more fossilized. And I think that's really versatile and gives us options when it comes to portraying materials on our tiny little miniatures, and that to me is a good thing. So I am mixing up a little bit more of this stuff. Mix. Yeah, and yeah, so for this section, oops, it's actually not blue enough. Than me. So as you can see, I'm kind of doing this a little bit free form, because I have to be honest, I'm slightly annoyed by the process of painting this miniature so far. Nothing to do with the miniature. The miniature is lovely. It's just the fact that my technical issues caused me to lose half of the, or at least the whole section of my voiceover where I recorded my filming of the gun. That sort of weird flamethrower looking weapon over there, which I haven't yet spoken about still, unfortunately, because I've been annoyed. But yeah, so let's just jump into it. So essentially, what I wanted to do was create a biological kind of flamethrower, and to that end, just like the flesh borer example that I described earlier, what I wanted to do is to have an organic component. So my logic was that there was an egg of some sort, which is why there is a cracked egg over there, which is that vaguely sort of flesh tone, vaguely purple ovoid, and that's being cracked to yield an explosive substance by this cable. And I really wanted to suggest that this was a living creature, therefore there is an eye on the front, even though I think originally that's supposed to be a cable, but I painted it as an eye as well as one on the back, and that really gives you the sense that this is a weird composite creature that's making biological use of another, violently against its will, I presume. I don't think anybody's eggs ever want to be destroyed willingly. But yeah, essentially that has become the basis for how this Zoat flamethrower works. To give you a better idea, let's zoom in a little bit more. So yeah, essentially that's the eggy bit, and that's the part that's kind of burst into it, and then there's the sort of like malignant eye over there. The flamethrower nozzle is very much reminiscent of early designs of 40k flamethrowers, so very lends itself quite easily to that kind of narrative. And I think it helps essentially to have an idea of how things work, at least on some level. It doesn't need to be exhaustive in its perfection, but at least it should suggest a little bit about how things operate. And that kind of level of world building is something that may or may not be extant in the miniatures you paint. I was lucky insofar as this Zoat model has little clues as to how it sort of functions, how it operates within the sculpt of the miniature, but you could add these things on your own. Nothing's really stopping you in that sense. Yeah, and that's kind of what makes miniatures like this worth painting, even when, unfortunately, technology betrays you and everything goes down south. So, adding a little bit more definition to the bone areas, including filling in some areas that I missed. And then I think the point after this is to come in with a highlight and to start to give life to this area. Yeah. What I'm seeing, however, is that there are tiny little bits where I perhaps did not perform the cleanup job with the rigor that I would expect. So a little bit of trimming, unfortunately, guys. This sometimes happens, especially when you're all flustered. Oops. Yeah. Okay. So green. Nuclear green for the eyes, which is a look I always enjoy. There's something almost Fallout about this guy, right? Like, I mean, I know the whole Centauroid body plan is something that occurs quite a bit in the Fallout universe, but there are design elements to this. Probably it's a mask. It kind of looks like power armor. Fallout power armor. And it looks cool. So emerald green, just to because it works really well with the red. This is Ildari Emerald. Provides a bit of lift to the overall color scheme. A point of interest to draw your eye away from the mundanity of, the color that we're using really in large abundance, which in this case is clearly the that sort of reddish skin. So applying this basically gives our eyes a bit of relief. And because of how different it is hue-wise, it really draws our eye to it and really makes it visually interesting. I'm trying very hard to avoid doing like the sort of yellow and white stripes that I so often do on like cabling and wiring as a way of like speeding up, detail, adding detail to a surface, because I just don't think that it has a place on a miniature like this. That's just too human and real world. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I think it looks strange in orcs even. Simply because I don't think orcs do wiring the way humans do wiring. But it is what it is. And sometimes you paint something not because of whether there's an internal logic or a kind of color scheme to it, but more because people recognize what it is straight away, and therefore you're not fighting against your audience, so to speak, in their conception. So more emerald cables. They may look monotone and samey right now, but when we come in and we apply a bit of a highlight for these, and to be fair, we don't need a lot of a highlight. Yeah, you can sort of see that kind of like cracked egg kind of logic to. I imagine this armor and this plate, these are original Zoat technologies, but then they've been infiltrated by all these Tyranid tentacles. Just kind of gross and body horror-y in the best way. In a way that hasn't been seen in 40k for quite a while, unfortunately. But yeah, there you go. I suppose you could say that the gene stealers, the Malstrain gene stealers from Necromunda, kind of have a little bit of that going. But the idea that the Tyranids would somehow themselves become the hosts for something else, it's too many hosts, man. I don't know whether that's a good thing, but your mileage will vary. And the truth is, 40k universe is big, and anything that makes the 40k universe big and less known, less cataloged, and less like understandable, the less the 40k world or setting functions like a Wikipedia entry, essentially, the better. Sorry, guys. Sorry, guys. My Zoat was kind of running away for a second. Clearly, he hasn't lost all of his free will. So I'm coming in with a bit of Vallejo Silver Grey to provide highlights and also to clean up some of the areas which were not entirely legit before I slapped down this Skeleton Horde and Gryphcharger Grey contrast mix. But no harm, no foul. Once you apply a highlight, it kind of cleans up a lot of the areas where the mix was not exactly homogeneous below it. And I think it looks just fine after that. Okay. Cool. So now let's jump into a little bit of dark flesh, or rather dark sand, to provide the initial highlight for all these bony bits. And this is just the way that I do things. The first highlight can be kind of bold and slightly over applied, because you can come in, you can trim away at any highlights that you consider a little bit too over the top. The point here is to make sure that you've got the color that you want represented actually on the miniature. I do like this shade of bone. Something about the green in it really kind of makes it feel even more organic to me. It reminds me a little bit of like turtle bone. Like, weirdly enough, the bones of turtles. I promise I've never actually been the direct cause of death of a turtle, but the bones of turtles kind of have a little bit of a green cast to them, and that's kind of quirky and interesting to me. Kind of interesting looking, if a little bit disturbing. Okay, so a tiny little bit of bone on the top of his head. Now has a bit of color. And the kind of more textured, crenulated sort of. I mean, when you look at this section, this plate on his belly, the sort of, the little dimples and kind of pock marks and pitted sections just really remind me of the inside of a larger human bone, kind of like a femur. And I really like that look, that level of detail to try to create something familiar yet unfamiliar at once. And in that sense, this miniature does that really nicely. Really appreciate the level of, I guess, attention to detail. Sorry guys, gonna move the cradle arm a little bit. It's a bit low for this miniature. So yeah, thanks for listening, guys. I think I've moved beyond my initial irritation with the tech problem, thanks to just leaning into painting this and just rambling on about Tyranid creatures. I think it does me no end of benefit. And I think you can sort of see why I produce these miniatures and why I paint them. Because it does me a lot of good. Psychologically. And talking to you guys does me a lot of good. And I really enjoy it. And I hope you do too. And if you're listening at this stage, there's a chance you might actually enjoy this kind of content, because I don't think anybody who doesn't enjoy the kind of things that I talk about is still listening at this point. I think there is zero chance. And I hope you are still here and you will continue to join me for these forays into 40k stuff and fantasy stuff, all these like obscure little bits and bobs, because I really do find them fascinating, and I really do find that exploring the roots of our hobby really does wonders for the way we approach, our appreciation for them, especially at a time when new things are coming hard and fast. It's always nice to sort of take a step back and see how things were back in the day, just so we appreciate them more. We appreciate the new stuff more. So I'm adding a bit of a highlight, adding a bit of silver gray, which is my undercoat color, which you can sort of see there in the parts which I haven't yet put any paint on. Yeah, just applying these as quick highlights, which can be blended into, if needed, feathered to match if necessary, but otherwise I think they look pretty good. Okay. Bit of extra texture. Cool. So now we've got these exposed ribbed bits, which I think a bit of Magos purple will go a long way towards unifying with Tyranid creatures. It's a little bit like what you see on the back of old Gene Stealers, right? Where you kind of have ribbed textured skin. And I think that looks kind of good. It's always good to kind of unify, or to at least, have callbacks to Tyranid bodily components, or textures, or patterns, or color schemes, or just detail riffs to connect them conceptually and to make sure that this Zoat looks good next to a bunch of Tyranids. Like they look like they're connected in some way. Unfortunately, in the case of this one Zoat, physically as well as visually. Yep. And then a little bit more. Oh no, that's bone. I'm sorry. Bone. Bone sauce, maybe. More emerald. There is a lot going on in this miniature, and I do not have a systematic process for tackling all of the individual details. Good lord. But I guess that's what makes this model kind of fun to paint, because there's just so much going on. And because of it, because of the fact that it's I guess as a result of it being an older miniature, a lot of this stuff is sculpted at 1:1 scale. So it's actually quite challenging to get some of the finer points as regular. So as you can see in the way I've basically fudged some of the green cabling areas, it's actually quite hard to get it completely like neat and regular. So I hope you realize that I've just fudged it. And I think it still looks okay despite that. So adding in a little bit of the fresher bone color, the less yellow one, into his face mask. So that it's kind of same but different, Same in the sense that it feels like part of the same concept, but extended over a very different part of the body. Different in the sense that it's a different creature, different organism, kind of unique. And he's got a bolt pistol, or something that resembles a bolt pistol, with weird ammo parts. Like, that's crazy looking, and yet so very Tyranid. And I love that. We need Zoats again, man. And I think it could happen, like one day, just because, as Games Workshop gradually runs out of things to sell. Maybe one day they will lean back into the weird and pull out a Zoat or two. Maybe they'll just have them a lot more infested. Because I mean, Games Workshop at this point, I believe they can easily make. They could sell you almost anything, right? Like the, I think just the commitment levels of the fan base are such that basically they could sell you just about anything they wanted, and you'd be happy for it. So who knows? Maybe they would come back and do some kind of a Zoti thing. The formula for releasing Games Workshop stuff now appears to be make it at least, 30% nostalgia, 60% good sculpting, and 10% rules that people like stick onto. 10% because honestly, rules get replaced with such frequency these days that there is very much the impression that even if the rules may look good right now, you never know when Games Workshop will pull a Leans of 10 and essentially nerf or change your rules before you even get the book in your hands. And that's unfortunate, but it's just how it is. The age of the internet, where itchy trigger fingers define change. This is what we have to deal with nowadays. But that said, even though Games Workshop is in the business of outmoding miniatures today, I believe that miniatures are eternal. And so long as we continue to paint and to have appreciation for the old alongside the new, there's not a lot that Games Workshop can do to invalidate your collection. So long as you remember that they're just miniatures, and miniatures can be used for anything, any game system you enjoy. And among friends, there is no such thing as a band model. Only options not yet explored. And I genuinely believe that because I don't think I've played a current Games Workshop game for a long ass time. Everything that I played has either been some kind of a modification or else it's been played with people who are quite willing to do house rules because we recognize very much that. And not all of this is Games Workshop's fault, right? Insofar as it's hard to produce like a cogent set of rules that pleases everyone these days. What you have is a million different needs and wants and so on. So it can be difficult to have something that kind of addresses every need or, is universally appealing. So this isn't even about bashing Games Workshop. This is just the reality of choice in the wargame industry these days. The idea that there are a million solutions to every problem that you might have, and Games Workshop is just merely staying on top of it. So yeah, I don't. I think there was definitely a time when I was less chill about the Games Workshop hobby in general, either as a participant or as a critic. I became very critical of it at one point. I still am, arguably. But yeah. But at some point, you have to realize that everything that Games Workshop does is just financial, and that's because that decision making component of Games Workshop has shifted from the creatives very firmly into the camp of the executives, and as a result, decisions are rarely, if anything, based purely on the health of the game, but rather on its saleability as a concept, and that's just how it has to be. And to be honest, you are still ultimately in control of whatever it is that you play and whatever it is that you enjoy. So, with the right group of like minded friends, and to be honest, this is the internet, you can find like minded alien freaks no matter where you are, or at least connect with them online, make new connections, find people who you vibe with, and enjoy your games with them instead, as opposed to getting locked within an ecosystem. After all, your own miniature collection is your own little private exploration into the 40k universe, and everything that you discover there is legit if you say it is. So, silver grey now, as the next highlight for bone. I like this because it lifts up the intensity while desaturating the bone, making sure that it's not quite too yellow. This is the case maybe when you apply bone exclusively, or variants of bone essentially, exclusively as highlights. At some point, I like the idea that the bone transitions away to just the raw calcium buildup of the external surface of a bony plate. As you move away from the growth zones of your bone, it generally becomes more and more um, dead, more almost like enamel, not keratinized, but like enamel, and is further away from the growing surface, which is deep inside the bone. Cool. This Zoat is looking pretty good in my opinion. And psychologically, it's been a real barrier for me to get this model done on account of my hour or two spent painting yesterday, which yielded no footage that I could use. Unfortunately, I'm not really set up to do audio recording, unfortunately, so no voiceover. But today, at least, we will finish this guy off. I hope. And I hope you've enjoyed the ride, talking about obscure subjects. As we paint this obscure beast. Now we go on to pure white for the very extremities. I do love painting bone. Something about it is so satisfying. Just the way you can layer it up, so you've got different colors under the surface of your bone. Because like any organic material, when it grows, it's more when it's new and growing, it's more intense color. And as it gets older, it kind of fades and dries out on the surface. It kind of fades and becomes chalky. A bit more purple. And a little bit of this around where the various pipes and cubes have perforated. This armor, so it looks a little bit sore and unpleasant. And our Zoat is rapidly coming together. Just making sure that the junctions of each of these segments is relatively sharp and clean. A bit of purple. This pistol. A bit of highlight on his belly armor plates. I think these are actually organic. It's kind of like got dinosaur belly. Speaking of dinosaurs, in a White Dwarf once, it was mentioned that Tyranids are really inspired by dinosaurs and not by bugs. And I guess the Zoat is a really strong example of how this is a dinosaur and not a bug. Because this guy looks incredibly dinosaurian when you look at it. He's kind of got like the ankylosaur lower body. And that's kind of cool. I never put that together until now. But yeah, on this model, more so than other miniatures, it has to be said, other Tyranid miniatures. Yeah, that sort of dinosaur ancestry is really, or at least that sort of concept is very evident. And it's kind of cool. I like it. Okay. So guys, I think that's where I'm calling it. I think he looks pretty good. He's not perfect, but I needed to just get this model out and done and out of the way because I think it become a little bit of a mental roadblock for me. So thanks for listening to me rant and to complain about my technical issues and others. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed listening to me ramble on about Tyranids and Dacians and Sarmatians and Romans and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, have a good one. Like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed what you watched. I promise I will be more on topic and more on theme the next time I join you for another video. And I'll see you in the next one. Cheers. Love you all. Bye-bye.